Hi! Now we need to move into our urinary system discussion. The biggest part about the urinary system that I'd like to talk with you about today is actually the nephron. As you've read, the nephron is the structural and functional subunit of the kidney, of really the entire urinary system. And so we need to really see how the nephron goes about filtering the blood that's coming through this system. So let me draw a picture of what the nephron looks like. This initial portion here is called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is just a big ball of capillaries where all of the blood is being brought into each of the nephrons. So before we move into the nephron, I actually need to talk really quick about this for a second. When we're dealing with nephrons, and when we're dealing with the fact that they filter all the blood, they take out the nitrogenous wastes, they also get rid of excess water, they get rid of excess ions that we just might not need so much of, maybe some of our water-soluble vitamins. There's a lot that's coming through the kidney that we have to get rid of. Now, in order to do this, what happens is that blood comes in through an arteriole called the afferent arteriole. Think about A for arriving. So this is the part that's arriving in the big capillary bed, which is the glomerulus right here. And then the efferent arteriole, think E for exit. The efferent arteriole is the one that takes the blood away from this glomerulus. Now, what happens in here is that this is going to be really similar to what we've talked about earlier on in the semester when we dealt with membrane transport. Usually we've talked about transport in the sense of there being a high concentration of some molecule on one side of the vessel and then a low concentration on the other side, maybe down in here, which is kind of the part that's wrapping around this glomerulus from the nephron. But when we're talking about the kidney, it's not actually a concentration gradient that we're going down, it's actually going to be a pressure gradient. And when you hear about filtration, that is specifically a type of transport that involves the movement of molecules down a pressure gradient, meaning that this is where molecules go from a high pressure to low pressure. It even sounds similar to what we talked about with gases in the respiratory system. But here in this afferent arteriole, the body is able to keep the pressure somewhat high. And what that does is that really enforces the idea that everything is going to move into the nephron because it's kept at a low pressure in relative terms, a low pressure situation compared to this afferent arteriole and to the glomerulus that comes in. Now, excuse me, this is an important thing to think about in terms of blood pressure in general. Because blood pressure is kept a little bit high inside this glomerulus, that actually means that changes in blood pressure or increases in blood pressure in the rest of the body can actually have a fairly damaging effect here in the kidney because the pressure is already high and these structures are very delicate. So we need to make sure that we maintain a little bit of a high pressure, but that it doesn't go too far. Excuse me. So let's take a look at this glomerulus in terms of the nephron. Let's see, it's right. Oops, sorry. Right here. So here's our efferent arteriole, and our afferent arteriole, remember A for arriving, so it's coming into the glomerulus. The glomerulus has the high pressure. And then this yellow capsule around it, called the glomerular capsule, is where we have a low pressure. And because of that pressure gradient, that means that lots and lots of material is going to move out of the glomerulus from the blood supply and into this glomerular capsule, which is the entrance of the nephron. Now, everything that moves into the nephron is referred to as filtrate because it has been filtered through the holes in the capillaries, meaning it's gone from high pressure to low pressure. It's almost like a big push that's happening. However, filtrate should not include blood cells or proteins, simply because the holes in the capillaries are too small for the blood cells and the proteins to fit through. But that means that water, ions, glucose, other types of nutrients, other types of waste products, they all make their way here into the nephron through that process of filtration. If you're familiar with the idea of dialysis, dialysis is just a synthetic way of achieving the same type of filtration. That happens when somebody's kidneys are failing and you don't have the filtration process happening normally in this glomerular capsule. And so you take the blood and you push it through a filter outside of the body, and as the blood comes back into the body, it's pretty much taken care of. The dialysis machine has done the job of filtration that the glomerular capsule would have done had it been functioning properly. So all of the water, all of the nutrients, all of these excess molecules and wastes make their way into this nephron, into the filtrate. And as they move through, really about 99% of everything that comes into the filtrate gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. This efferent arteriole actually has a whole lot of extensions that come out and surround the rest of the nephron, so that when things get pushed into the nephron, we can also reabsorb it really quickly back into the bloodstream. So let me erase that because that got really scribbly for a second. Sorry about that. So we have the filtrate here, and we reabsorb most of what actually goes in. So most of that reabsorption happens here in what's called the proximal convoluted tubule. There's more reabsorption that happens as you go down and back up, and eventually all of this filtrate makes its way into what's called the collecting duct. The collecting duct then moves into what we would call a minor calyx, which then goes into the major calyx, if you were looking at the anatomy of the kidney. And then the major calyx moves into the renal pelvis, and eventually that makes its way into the ureter. So all of these nephrons together in the kidney actually dump into common collecting ducts. All those collecting ducts converge, all those calyces converge, and you end up collecting all the urine that's being produced into that ureter. So the filtrate that makes its way through the nephron actually is what becomes the urine. Okay? Whoops, sorry about that. So we reabsorb about 99% of what we push into the nephron, and that 1% that's left over ends up being what is excreted from the body.